Welcome to the Vanderbilt Philosophy Department faculty interviews. I'm here with Professor Lenn Goodman. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Scott.
Professor Goodman completed his BA in philosophy at Harvard, but it was also a joint
It was
degree.
a dual major,
Yeah.
I majored in philosophy and Near Eastern languages and literatures, which was mainly Arabic at that time, and that really enriched my program.
And provided a kind of a foundation for the breadth of the work that continued on afterwards.
Yes, and I was able to study Islamic history and get a tutorial from Sir Hamilton Gibb, and I had some people on the Arabic side who paid very close attention to my work. Ilse Statter was one of them, and she really got me started on a lot of the things that I was later to do.
And you then continued your work at the University of Oxford, where you got your DPhil.
Yes.
Then from there, was it directly to Hawaii, or
I had a year as a visiting professor at UCLA.
There. Okay, UCLA.
Yeah.
And then
after that 1 year visiting professorship, I was recruited out to Hawaii. They had been looking for somebody. They specialize in comparative philosophy, and they had people in Buddhist and Chinese and Indian philosophy. They had been looking for somebody who did Islamic philosophy in particular, and they had not been able to find anyone, mainly because most of the people who work in that field do descriptive work, and they were looking for somebody who was actually a philosopher and engaging with that material. So I went to Hawaii. I thought I'd be there for a year or two, and I wound up being there 25 years. It was a wonderful experience, very educational to me. I learned how to do comparative philosophy in
that's
Hawaii.
The place to learn it.
Yeah, that was really the place to learn it. Yes.
And then to Vanderbilt in the mid-90s.
Yes, we came. My late first wife and I came to Vanderbilt in '94. She had been recruited to be the first woman dean of arts and science at Vanderbilt, and she did a brilliant job. But in her second year, she was diagnosed with a brain tumor and passed away in '96, and I remarried in '99. But she was a geneticist, and we did some work together, and I've carried on with that work in biophilosophy in particular.
And so here since the mid-90s, I took some classes from you whenever I was a graduate student here back in '98.
I remember
and
you as a great
Aristotle seminar, and your specializations. I guess the top of the charts there is Jewish and Islamic philosophy.
Yes.
So the God of Abraham, Islamic humanism, and then the published Gifford lectures, Love Thy Neighbor as Thyself, seem to be the sort of the three big selling books there. And then we also have the commentary and translation of Ibn Tufayl. Is that right?
Yes, I've done a number of translations and commentaries from the Arabic. Ibn Tufayl, a 12th century philosophical novel about a man who finds out the truth about the world without the help or interference of culture, language, other people. Fascinating work, had a big impact on the proto-Enlightenment period in the 17th century when it was first translated into Latin and then into English. 1671 and 1672 was the first English version, incomplete.
And we've also got some other translation work coming down the pipe with
Maimonides.
With the Maimonides translation, the Guide to the Perplexed.
I've been working on Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed since the 1970s, and amazing thing about the depth and profundity of that book, I learned something new from it every day. As recently as last night of this morning. No, honestly, I was just before you came into my office. I was writing up a new insight. There was something kind of coded that Maimonides had put into the early part of the book. It didn't really spell it out until much later. He wants you to read everything at least twice, and dig it out.
You've done that by now.
I've done a few. I've been through it a few times. That's a collaborative work with a colleague here at Vanderbilt, and similarly on the case of the animals versus man, which is an Islamic ecological fable from the 10th century. I collaborated with Richard McGregor from our own Islamic studies area, and on this one I collaborated with Phil Lieberman from Jewish studies.
It's great whenever, I mean, it is a sort of a test for a great work of philosophy, of literature, or just of insight, that it pays you back multiple times in going through. You'll learn something new, you see something new every time. It's really the mark of works of genius. It
is, and I'm just wrapping up. Today's the final session of my Plato seminar. And that Plato is another author of that caliber. That I learned something new from Plato every day, including as recently as last night.
Another philosopher who produces a number of works of genius. So again, now we're going to sort of get into sort of the breadth of your work. You also have got a lot of work in political philosophy. So back to the On Justice book, back from the early 90s, to the recent piece on the public sphere. And so tell us a little bit about that work.
Well, I consider myself really a philosopher, and therefore I think of philosophy as a kind of open inquiry. There are issues about justice. I did a book on truth, which I know you've read. I think that these issues are all connected together, and I haven't tried to confine myself. I do have that specialty, but in political philosophy, I was asked to do some lectures at Oxford. First time was because I won a prize from the American Philosophical Association, and I gave 3 lectures, which became my book, Monotheism, later much enlarged to God of Abraham. The 3 chapters or 3 lectures there became 9 chapters in God of Abraham. And they liked those lectures at Oxford and invited me back, and I gave a set of 8 lectures there about political philosophy, and that became On Justice. At the time, I was translating Sajid Gaon's commentary on the Book of Job, and my editor at Yale University Press, that was in the Yale Judaica series, said to me, I guess this was all by mail in those days, it wasn't email. He wrote in a letter, Len, you're a philosopher, why don't you give us a book of your own? And that led to my turning those Oxford lectures into the book On Justice, which when I was first working on that book, somebody said, oh, you're working on justice, you're working on Rawls? I said, well, Rawls enters into it, but I'm not really working on a virtual contract about justice the way Rawls did. I have an ontological theory of justice where justice resides in the individual, whether that's a person or an animal or an ecosystem or a cultural or natural artifact. I wanted to base the deserts of all individuals on what they are. There's a little bit of Spinoza in there in terms of the claims that beings make, which are manifest in their conatus, their striving to be what they are and persist and express themselves through what they do. That's the basis of that theory of justice, and I've carried that forward in other books as well. It's a very important idea for me.
And so the connection then between this, you might say, view about normativity and then views also about what is, and scientifically informed views about what is, has then also carried over into some work that you've done in philosophy, in a kind of an overlap area in philosophy of science and philosophy of mind. Your book Coming to Mind with Greg Karamanico shows this, and also your Creation and Evolution book show the connection here that you see in this kind of capacious way of seeing all these issues coming together.
Yes, Scott. Creation and evolution, I want to show people who worry that religious ideas are incompatible with scientific ideas. I wanted to show them that Darwinian evolution is very teleological. As J.B.S. Haldane once said, teleology to a biologist is like a person having a mistress. He can't live without her, but doesn't want to be seen in public with her. So they don't like the word teleology. But if you look at the number of times the idea of what's good for an animal or what's good for an animal lineage or plant lineage is what explains the evolution of a trait, the persistence of a trait, the dropping out of a trait or a process biologically, that's central. Darwin takes the idea of adaptation, which was kind of a given in Aristotle, and he turns it into a dynamic process which needs to be explained and can only be explained historically in terms of the fate of a lineage over a population over time.
So this is a very broad set of interests.
Yes.
And it looks like you're seeing philosophy pretty much everywhere you go. What brought you into philosophy? What was the hook? How did you get into the discipline?
I really arguments on the playground when I was a kid. You'd argue with the other kids about. I remember in primary grades we were arguing about God, and I didn't believe in God in those days. And later on, junior high school, arguing about Freud, and I came up with something like what I later learned Karl Popper had said about unverifiable versus unfalsifiable. People would say, well, everybody has these dreams. And I'd say, well, I don't have those dreams. And they say, well, you're suppressing.
You don't know that you're...
Yeah,
you don't know that you've got those dreams.
The counter evidence just proves the case.
That's right, yeah, you're complaining too much about it.
What John Wisdom said about philosophy and paranoia, philosophy and psychosis, that the counter evidence just adds up to more evidence.
Yeah. So in some ways, the Socrates of the playground. Then,
I wasn't as good at it as Socrates was, but I was.
Well, they didn't make you drink hemlock.
No, that's right. But that's why I wanted to learn the skills that would enable me to carry an argument. So I think everybody has pre-philosophical predispositions, notions that you favor, emotional attachments. How do you make them make sense? How do you make them rigorous? How do you make them? How do you revise your views and learn from your own mistakes? Or just my father used to kid about a man who came out to Long Beach in California with $1, one shirt, and one idea, and he hasn't changed any of them since. And I think one needs to grow philosophically, and you do that partly by learning from other philosophers, partly by testing your arguments against counter cases. I think some of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century, when I was coming up,
They changed your mind.
Well, the good ones changed their mind, but some of them just dug in.
Oh.
And they didn't think about counter cases.
Okay.
You mentioned the book on religious pluralism, a lot of which is devoted to Rawls. And Rawls, as I indicated before, was carrying on a virtual contract theory. What would people sign on to if they were signing on to a contract? If they were rational people and if they were not coerced and so forth. And he didn't really try to consider the counter evidence. What he did was he packed his notion of rationality and non-interference, non-coercion, non-fraud. He packed those assumptions into his premises so that his argument became tautologous. We don't know what real rational people would do, but we know what theoretical rational people would do if they would do
it was
what Rawls
stipulated
said.
in a particular way.
It all becomes stipulative. So that was one criticism. And Rawls is a very important philosopher in ethical political philosophy, but he made that very serious mistake. Go back to Plato. Plato always tested his ideas. So in his late life, Plato's taking the theory of forms and putting it through the ringer with an imaginary Parmenides. Criticizing it, making very serious criticisms.
Yeah.
And Plato can rise to those criticisms, but he's not done just when he's had a brilliant idea.
So you changed your mind. So you said that you were an atheist
I did.
when you were, and so tell us about the role that religion plays in, and what's the connection between religion and philosophy in your work?
It's a deep connection, and I know you've read a fair amount of my work, so we're aware of the presence of that connection. Tricky to explain, really. Some of it's autobiographical, and religion reaches you on a very personal, very familial, very ancestral level. My parents, as young people, I was born when my parents were very young people. Just at the not even the end of world. I don't count as a baby boomer because I was born in '44, so I'm not a post-war baby boomer.
Okay.
But my parents were young radicals, and they became disillusioned with the leftist movement, partly because of what Stalin was doing to the Jews, partly because they matured. When we moved to California, my mother decided, as a sort of pledge to her grandmother, her parents were also radicals. Her father was an anarchist, a wobbly. But we affiliated with a synagogue, and I got involved, and I started to learn. I remember one very deep, very thoughtful, very learned teacher. He had a doctorate from the old country, and he had another souvenir from the old country, which was a number on the forearm. He had been in a concentration camp, and his name was Dr. Lubliner, and it was from him that I first heard the name of Aristoteles. I didn't know that was the same person as Aristotle, whom I had heard before. I was a kid at the time. I started in that Hebrew school, was at 9, 10 years old. And one of the things that I remember was a turning point for me. I remember Dr. Lubliner, and this was a man teaching elementary Hebrew school in the afternoons as a part-time job because he couldn't get a real academic job of the kind that he had trained for in this country in the 50s. I remember his saying once, he didn't talk personally very much, but he said once, "I believe there must be justice." And that stayed with me. And I remember thinking, if a man like that can believe in God, maybe I can too. That happened when I was maybe 10, 11 years old. And of course it went further and it became philosophical, but I don't think the roots of one's existential commitments are philosophical. Philosophy is a way of structuring and making more rational, as I've tried to do ever since, really. In Jewish philosophy, I represent a rationalist strain. That's the affinity between me and Maimonides, who's the great rationalist of the tradition. I read some of the Talmud as rationalistic, and I bracket some of the Talmud as superstitious and legalistic, and committed oftentimes, not always, to legal positivism, which is a tradition in political philosophy and legal philosophy that I argue against. But there are many streams of thought in the Talmud, and you can learn from it. One of the things it says in the Talmud is, "Who is wise? He who learns from all people," and that's something I try to do. Even the people whom you think are really on the wrong track. It takes somebody like Daniel Dennett or much worse, Richard Dawkins. I disagree with those folks, but I have taught them. I learned from them, and I move on. They have something to contribute. They have insights. I spent a lot of time at a certain stage in my career. Now we have a great Kant specialist in our department, but I used to teach Kant all the time, and I felt that Kant is not the be-all and end-all of philosophy, but there was immense profundity and sophistication in his writing, and this is something one has to grapple with. As I did in God of Abraham, for example, I tackle Kant's alleged refutation of the ontological argument, which I found was built on two different approaches which were contradictory to each other. His thesis, that Humean thesis, that all existential propositions are synthetic, and his denial that existence is a predicate. Those two propositions, as I argue in God of Abraham, are inconsistent with each other. If existential propositions are synthetic, that means the attribution of existence has added something. That's what Avicenna, another philosopher who's important to me, the great Muslim philosopher of the 11th century, Avicenna says that existence is a predicate precisely because you can abstract from the existence of anything at all except one being, which is the necessary being.
So this is another extension of the religious rationalist tradition that you're keeping alive.
Yes.
One of the main challenges to religious rationalism has been called the Euthyphro dilemma. All it goes all the way back to Plato. You might say the touchstone rationalist. And in some ways, the Euthyphro dilemma is considered to be a kind of test piece for religious rationalists. But you have a unique solution to the Euthyphro, or a way of handling the Euthyphro dilemma that's both rationalist and also gives uniquely religious claims some status. So frame the problem for us, and then explain your approach.
Sure. The problem, very briefly, and I think that particular dialogue, because it's short, is widely used in undergraduate courses, and the intent very often, too often I think, is to get the undergraduates to agonize. Is what's good because God says it is, or is it good because it is, and therefore God's hands get tied and God is shackled by notions of justice, and the real judge of justice, you're supposed to conclude, the real judge of justice or goodness or piety or holiness or whatever the variable is your own conscience if you're a 17th century Puritan, or your own personal take on it if you're a, let's say, 20th century existentialist.
Okay.
And I think that's a misuse of the Euthyphro problem. The Euthyphro dialogue is an aporetic dialogue. That means on the surface of it, it reaches no conclusion. It ends in a kind of an impasse. That was a trick that Plato used in order to avoid pleading guilty in behalf of Socrates. That is, Socrates was not really misleading the youth. He was not really trying to teach anybody at all. That's what sophists did. They would charge a fee for teaching. Socrates was really just interested in pursuing the truth, and the best way of pursuing it in Socrates' practice was to question people's unquestioned assumptions. Plato's right about that, of course, but very often, in order to avoid portraying Socrates as a teacher and therefore misleader of the youth, he makes it look on the surface as if those early Socratic dialogues have reached no conclusion, no real answer. So in the Law case, for example, which is about courage, the answer is actually given, but it's sort of shunted aside. The answer is that courage is a form of knowledge.
Puts it in Nicias's mouth, though.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's knowing what's worth taking risks for.
That's right.
Maybe even what's worth dying for. But that's shunted aside, and nominally the conclusion of the dialogue is that there is no conclusion. In the Euthyphro, we get what's typically represented as a dilemma. Either you're going to limit God's power, grace, justice, and so forth, or you're going to make things arbitrary. You're going to have to sort of pay your money. It takes your choice. What I did with the Youth of Fro, and folks are welcome to read my piece on it. What's it called? Ethics and God, or God and Ethics?
God and Ethics, and it came out in Philosophical Investigations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And what I walk people through the dialogue pretty closely in that, so I won't be able to do it all here. But the basic thesis of that article is that people are presenting a false dilemma between choosing between God's judgment and our own. The reason being that they're interpolating a notion of God which separates God from the idea of right or holiness or truth or piety or any of those objective values. That's a kind of sleight of hand. It's a shell game. They're still using the name of God or the word of God, but they're not really looking at the idea of God as monotheism puts it forward, where, as Maimonides puts it, God and God's justice are inseparable. God's justice is who he is. You can say the same about God's love and God's benevolence and God's goodness. So asking people to choose between what God says, you get your hypothetical cases. Kant raises some, so does James Rachels. He pushes that point in an article he wrote, which I take on in my article. They substitute for the idea of the monotheistic God some kind of being who might just arbitrarily demand you do.
He could demand otherwise.
That's right, because God's power is absolute. There is an important sect in Islamic philosophy which solves a problem of theodicy that they have by saying that God can do whatever he wants and we have nothing to say about it. But that is not the mainstream monotheistic tradition, certainly not in Judaism, not in an important counter school in Islam, not in a lot of Christian thinkers. They've substituted a different idea of God, where God is a kind of arbitrary Oriental despot sort of being who could tell you to do terrible things. And of course, they use the story of Abraham's binding of Isaac and as the paradigm case of that argument. I've analyzed that story biblically in some considerable detail in God of Abraham, and in fact, the cover of that book is Rembrandt's drawing of that event. The moral of that story, if you read it right through to the end, is that God was revealing his true nature at Mount Moriah. The word Moriah in Hebrew means the place of the revelation. Abraham's evasive answer to Isaac, when Isaac says, I see the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the offering? And Abraham evasively answers, God will see to it. Notice the Hebrew, not God will provide, God will see to it. The voice of that verb gets reversed at the end. This is the place where God was seen. Not where God did the seeing, but where God was seen. What was seen about God was that the usual notion that if you really have an absolute God, you're going to make the absolute biggest sacrifice, namely your firstborn son, or not firstborn in Abraham's case, but your favorite son. No. What was revealed about God is the inseparability of God's love and justice and truth. God didn't want that kind of religion, which was quite commonplace. I have extensive evidence, both textual and archaeological, that others have collected to show that human sacrifice was not that unusual. The notion of Gehenna, for example, Gehenna was a valley just outside, still contested territory, just outside the walls of Jerusalem, where people were sacrificing their children to please their God. That was that was something that the prophets always inveighed against. And this story of the binding of Isaac is the story where it's not that God has changed his mind, but that God's image in our
showing
minds,
us something.
Yes, it's the place. That's what Moriah means. It's the place where God revealed his true nature.
Okay.
Very dramatic. It's characteristic of the book of Genesis in particular that philosophical points are made dramatically. Sometimes by dramatic irony, sometimes by a play on words, when the voice of that verb changed. Instead of God will see to it, God will be seen. Very, very interesting technique. One of the things you have to learn, and Maimonides says this, Scripture does philosophy as if it were revelation, in the language of revelation. In order to translate it into the language that we can recognize as philosophical, maybe even with numbered paragraphs and so forth, you have to use a little bit of mental flexibility. But there's a lot of philosophy in Scripture, as there is in a Zen koan, or as there is in ancient mythology, as Aristotle says, the myth makers were the original experimenters in philosophy.
So your work, again, given its breadth, given and in some ways the reading of so many of these points in the history of philosophy and the history of religion as transformational, has got a lot of uptake. In particular, international uptake. So tell us about some of the responses that you've received and some of the invitations that you've got.
Well, this is a wonderful thing to me. You asked me what brought me into philosophy, and I brought you back to the playground. But one of the really important things in getting into the kind of philosophy that I do was to realize there were two things that drew me to study Arabic, beginning on the UCLA high school program when I was a kid. So as a freshman at Harvard, I'm taking intermediate Arabic with a bunch of graduate students. One of the things that drew me into the study of Arabic was my father had told me that when he was a student of philosophy at Harvard, he got to study with Harry Austrian Wolfson. And Wolfson had shown his students that the encounter between religion, monotheistic religion in particular, and philosophy, Greek philosophy in particular, really happened in the Islamic period when the Muslims were taking over works of science, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and so forth, and getting into it and engaging with it and carrying it further and testing their own religious ideas against the Greek religious ideas were also, Greek philosophical ideas were also religious as well as scientific and rationalistic, but they had to test one culture set of intellectual values against another. That was one of the things that drew me to study Islamic philosophy in particular, and that's what I went to Oxford to study. That's what I studied in my undergraduate years too. But the other thing was the hope of enhancing mutual understanding between Muslims and Arabs and Jews and other people in the West. And that, as you intimated, has begun to bear fruit in a very exciting way. So I will be invited to talk about animals at the Islamic Thinking Center at Harvard, or I will speak at the Ismaili Institute in London, or just a few days ago I was speaking at, this one was virtual, it was, we can't travel there just yet for a couple of different reasons, but there's a university in Izmir, that's the ancient Smyrna, on the Aegean coast of Turkey, and it's called Ege University, which means Aegean in Turkish. I didn't know when they first invited me, but the fellow who founded that department and whom they hold in great reverence was the man who translated my book Islamic Humanism into Turkish. And my work meant a lot to him. And so when I took part in that conference via Zoom, it was a big thrill for me. And there are folks in Turkey who are looking to a more open, more intellectual, more rational, more humane approach to the religion than might be represented by their present government. And that's very exciting. I have a Turkish graduate student now who is working on rationalism and empiricism and hoping to reconnect the philosophical tradition of Islamic countries with its rationalistic roots and its empiricist roots, which he feels was a big factor not only in the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment and so forth, but also in the liberalism. Locke saw a deep connection between liberalism and empiricism. This was the defining moment of Locke's philosophical life, as he himself described it. I wrote an article about that recently on the Molyneux question. My student Ismail Kurun is very interested in exploring that. I have another student from Morocco now who has come on a Fulbright. He's not officially here at Vanderbilt. He's doing his degree at Hassan II University in Casablanca, but I will be co-examiner of his doctoral dissertation, and it's about moral realism in Islamic thinkers. He's discovering wonderful things. His name is Shafiq Greker, and Shafiq is discovering wonderful things in very early and very orthodox Islamic texts where they make moves, and more than moves, in the direction of moral realism. Moral realism is a counter force to what's often assumed to be the theistic subjectivism of Orthodox Islam. And he's finding in some of the most orthodox, some of the extreme conservative Muslim thinkers of the classical age, texts which are openly and enthusiastically exemplifying moral realism. One thing that he was going over with me just recently was there's a collection of hadiths. These are sayings and doings ascribed to Prophet Muhammad, and they have a near canonical status depending on the authority of the individual hadith, second only to the Quran. And there's one collection of hadiths which Shafiq has found, which is all about morals. And what this particular classical age collector of hadiths discovered was all the ones that are moral realistic, all dialectical. He's not saying a word about it himself. He's just collecting all the ones where the prophet is attributed to the prophet. These typically were not literally by the prophet, but they have a lot of authority anyway. The prophet is saying things, and his late first wife, whom he married when he was a young man, and she was an older woman, and she set him up as a merchant. Khadija is saying things. Aisha is saying things that represent moral realism in the form of questions, in the form of rhetorical questions. Don't you think this, etc., etc. Fascinating strand of Islamic tradition, which Shafiq wants to pull back into the light, so that people who are authentic and committed Muslims can see that there's more to their tradition than what they see in the newspaper.
So it sounds like your students are doing really exciting work. So
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about your teaching then.
Yes.
With this semester, we have the Plato seminar.
Yes.
In previous semesters, we've had an honors seminar that you taught on justice.
And another one on virtue.
And another one on virtue. We've had, you've taught medieval philosophy as part of our core curriculum for the history requirement for the philosophy major. Next semester, you're slated for Hellenistic philosophy. Is that right?
Hellenistic and late ancient.
Hellenistic and late ancient.
Don't
Don't lead off the late ancient.
Well, I like to include. Philo is borderline Hellenistic. He lives into the Common Era, but I like to include Origen, who is the first really philosophical Christian thinker, and I always teach his De Principiis, a wonderful book, and I like to include Plotinus. Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, which is very important for all the medieval philosophers, and brilliant philosopher, a follower of Plato, but a very creative thinker. And we have a translation by Stephen McKenna, which was Stephen McKenna was a friend of James Joyce, and writes a very poetic translation, which people who appreciate the lyricism of philosophy will appreciate it. It doesn't die with Plato. Yes, and another thing that I'm doing this immersion course, now completing its second of 3 semesters, which is on religion and science. These students have come forward kind of out of the blue. We read the Creation Evolution book, we read Coming to Mind, The Soul and Its Body, and we also read a book called Modern Physics and Ancient Faith by a research physicist who is deeply religious, and he runs, his name is Stephen Barr, and we actually got him to come on Zoom,
That's
because
great.
it was one of the
benefits of Zoom.
Instead of just complaining about Zoom, you can use it. And Barr spoke to our little group, and Barr actually ran anthropic principle is one thing that I've never really liked in philosophy. Some people make it as though the world was made for us or for us to understand or something like that. Barr is the first thinker I've ever come across, partly because he really knows his physics, who has a credible version of the anthropic principle. He has I think it's 12 or 15 things which aren't logical necessities, but if they weren't that way, life would be impossible, chemistry would be impossible, there would not be nothing in the world but hydrogen atoms, etc., etc. Very interesting use of that idea. And next semester I'm teaching Body and Mind as an honors seminar.
That's right. Great.
And there's I'm an emergentist in this area rather than a limitivist or whatever. And there's a book, kind of tough-minded book by a Christian philosopher. I don't know if he's still, William Hasker is his name. I don't know if he's still living, but the Google says he was born in 1935, so he may be at home someplace. I tried to reach out to him and didn't get any answer. But he wrote a book called The Emergent Self, which I'm having the students read, and I think I'm going to have them read a little Searle. I'm going to have them read certainly a little Descartes, but one of the things that we really have to confront is Jaegwon Kim and his notion of causal closure, which I argue about in Coming to Mind, and I think it's a bit overstated on his part, but he's a formidable.
The concept of supervenience is a version of the hardest problem, isn't it?
That's
I mean,
correct.
At least as Kim says, the problem of supervenience is the problem of mind.
That's right. That's right. And his idea of supervenience really becomes a form of epiphenomenalism.
Okay.
And there's a turning point in William James's philosophy, which I think is very relevant here, where James went into a deep funk over epiphenomenalism, which is the view that all the causation has to be from the body,
it's on the body side
to the mind, if there is a mind, and the supervenience is all that kind of one-way street. And so I'm very interested in neuroplasticity. I've got a student now who wants to do her honors thesis on neuroplasticity. She's a neuropsych student who's co-majoring in philosophy. The thing that James saw, James was in this deep funk. He was deeply depressed about epiphenomenalism, which was the fashionable name in his time for what Jae-Gwon Kim is calling supervenience, because of the one-way directionality of it in his thinking. And James came up with an idea, which he first entrusted to a book review and later expanded, which was a Darwinian idea, which was that if consciousness didn't have any survival value, it would never have evolved. Brilliant little piece of thinking, which he developed and expanded. But the point is, if your consciousness can't act, it's not going to do you any damn good. And this feature of living beings, human beings in particular, but animals are conscious too, wouldn't have evolved if it didn't have adaptive value. So there's a wonderful Darwinian argument in behalf of maybe it's not a one-way street.
Len, I think that we've come to the end of the interview, but I wanted to make sure that that if there was any other sort of strings left to pull, any other things that we wanted to close on.
I just want to close with an invitation. If the things that we're saying are of interest to you and you're a student, or if you see this someplace else, maybe not at Vanderbilt, reach out to me and send me an email and read some of the stuff I've written, so your email won't be just coming out of the blue. Because I like to talk. That's one of the virtues and or vices that I've kept from those junior high school days.
Exactly.
And
the Socrates of the playground continues.
Reach out to me and we can talk. There are people around who do that, and I'm not a great correspondent, but I would like to exchange ideas with people who find some value in the approach to philosophy that I'm not only trying to pursue, but also trying to recommend.
And so links to Professor Goodman's faculty page and to a number of his books will be in the description below. Thanks, Professor Goodman. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much, Scott.
All right.
Real pleasure.